It was a real pleasure to be asked to come and speak at the conference. Actually, I haven't been for a few years, I'm ashamed to say. Excuse me. I do have a bit of a frog as well. And I almost titled my presentation, A Crime Surveys for Life. And I can see a few people in the audience I've known for many years, most of you through the Crime Survey, because it's one of those pieces of work that never leaves you. Once you've touched it, you can never be rid of it. Whatever happens, it will keep coming back to you at some point. So for those of you early in your career who are just getting involved in the Crime Survey, this will be it for life. However, I thought I'd better not title it that, and I thought I would focus on something that I've been working on with some colleagues for the last few years, looking at a very interesting period of transformation in British but also global history around the drop in crime. And the great thing about the Crime Survey is it was there to measure that. We introduced this marvellous piece of research at a time when crime had been rising massively. And little did those of us who had been involved in criminology and had, who'd honed our skills on trying to understand why crime kept going up, suddenly had to start explaining why it was going back down again. And I think the great thing about Crime Survey, especially one that's been going as long as the British Crime Survey and the Scottish one, which became separate in 1993, and Northern Ireland as well, is that it does allow you to do that kind of longitudinal work where you can look at change over time. And if you take one thing away from my talk, it is that we need to do more to exploit the longitudinal nature of the data that we collect. We spend millions and millions of pounds collecting this information, so let's do more with it. I'm going to focus on using Crime Survey data to expose new and existing and exacerbating victim inequalities, which is something that others in this room have done fantastic work on. I'm looking at Mackie and James, who've done some tremendous work in this area too. And it's one of those areas that I think is deserving of further exploration. So, structure of my talk. I'm going to start by saying a little bit about the backdrop to the surveys, and this will not be news to those of you who are aware of why we introduced the survey, but it's a bit of a reminder about why we're here and why it became a priority for government to fund this major piece of work. And again, the backdrop to that was a major post-war rise in crime, not just in the UK, but in many other countries as well. Then we had an unforeseen turn of events, which was the crime drop. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and I'm going to focus mostly on who benefited the most from the crime drop. And I'm going to look at two specific aspects of that. One is around the victims, who is and isn't a victim, and the second part is more around the characteristics of individuals, and can we differentiate in terms of victim inequality based on different types of personal, household, and area level characteristics, and then I'll say a few concluding statements. So back to the backdrop to the survey. In the post-war years in many countries there was a steady and increasing rise in crime. On the right you can see a graph showing rise in recorded crime, police statistics from 1900, and the rise is quite dramatic after about the 1950s, and this trend was quite common in many other countries as well. And of course some of that is down to changes in police recording, so better recording of crime. Some of it was down to changes in legislation as well, so we introduced more crimes, we record more crimes. However, there is evidence, good evidence, to show that there was a kind of real rise in crime, both property crime and violent crime, over the period following the post-war years. There was also at this time a kind of concern about the extent to which, even though we knew that crime was rising, we knew that we weren't measuring all of it, so we didn't know the extent to which it was rising. Are we just recording things we didn't used to record, or actually are we seeing a real rise in crime? And interestingly, in the UK, it was Margaret Thatcher who was a great advocate for measuring crimes that were not being recorded by the police. She had ridden into power in 1981 on a law and order manifesto. It's extraordinary now to think that the leader of a Tory party might want to measure more crime. However, she was really quite keen to make sure that we were measuring as much crime as we possibly could and understanding more about that. And of course, Britain followed fairly close on the heels of the US, where the National Crime Victimisation Survey was introduced in the 1970s under President Johnson. That was the days in which we copied the US. But the other thing that was happening around this time was a concern about inequality and inequalities between those who were and were not victims. And in the 1970s, a series of local crime surveys were carried out in London, which showed that there were particular inequalities among certain social groups. It was the first time that we'd started to highlight the extent of violence and other types of crime that were experienced by women that weren't often being recorded by the police, particularly domestic violence, but also kind of trying to isolate and identify the extent of crime that was happening in more deprived social communities, many of whom did not go to the police when they were victims of crime. So that kind of concept of victim inequality was something that could be measured through a crime survey. And of course, this is all against a wider backdrop of a renewed interest in victims of crime and the rise of victimology as a discipline in the 60s and the 70s. And the appeal of the crime surveys was quite clear in many regards. It allowed governments to understand the true level of crime. I'll explain why I use that word in a minute. The true level of crime. So, being able to kind of measure more than we could measure through police statistics, because of course we knew that many crimes were not reported to the police, but there was also concern that many crimes were not being recorded by the police. So the crime surveys gave us the opportunity to examine this dark figure of crime, as it's been called. It could be used to find out about new and emerging crimes. That was certainly something that was thought about at the beginning, but of course now with hindsight, when we look at the changes in terms of technology and digitally enabled and controlled crime, we can see that we were actually measuring more crimes through digital means than we are through more kind of traditional means today. So again, it's been in place to capture that change in societal history. But it also, because it was a survey, remember police data might measure crime, but it doesn't collect anything really about the nature of the people that experience it, the circumstances, the context, any of that thing. So by introducing a crime survey where we could ask people more about their personal experiences, we were able to find out more about the nature of the crimes themselves, where they happened, when they happened, the context in which they happened, the characteristics of those people who experienced them, both as victims and where victims were able to tell us more about the offenders as well and the relationship between the two, and a whole host of other things, people's opinions of crime, perceptions of crime, and perceptions of the justice system. And of course we see over time that actually the crime surveys morphed a little bit in the 90s to become more tools that were being used to monitor the operation of criminal justice organisations. However, the core of the survey has continued to be measuring victimisation. And these first 4 bullet points are more or less word for word taken from the current crime survey for England and Wales website that publicises it to the public and tells them what the crime survey is about and why we do it. And that word true level of crime is on that website. But also I want to argue in my presentation today that the crime survey is much more than that. And we now have decades of crime survey data. So we need to start to recognise it not just as a tool that allows us to see a snapshot in time over different years, but actually as a longitudinal instrument that allows us to look at change over time, that allows us to look at issues of concentration in terms of victimisation, and contrasts between different groups. That's something that myself and Ben Matthews have written about recently. So that brings us on to the unforeseen turn of events. Of course, if we hadn't had a crime survey that started in the 80s, we may or may not have been able to verify that the crime survey was real using crime survey data. We may have explained it away using changes in police recorded crime data, although probably not, because the extent of the drop has been described as unprecedented. So following decades of an increase in crime across many countries, we started to see that crime was falling. This was first observed, of course, in the US, and the chart on the left here is a chart from Rick Rosenfeld, which shows a measure of crime, which shows the decline in both property crime and violent crime from about the kind of early to mid 1990s in the US. And then, of course, further research started to emerge from other countries as well. And on the right, this is a study by McVie and colleagues, which studied 26 different countries, both developed and developing countries, to examine trends in crime over time. And you can see the very large reductions in 5 different crime types over a period of time. That was using international crime victimization survey data. So there is irrefutable evidence that there's been a crime drop across many parts of the world. And that includes the UK, of course. We've seen crime drops here too. On the left here, we've got data which compares both police recorded crime data and survey data for England and Wales, showing crime drop from around the mid-1990s, early 2000s. The point of the drop varies for police and crime survey data. So it looks, the dotted line is the crime surveys information, and that looks like the crime drop was a lot earlier than the police data. However, you have to bear in mind, again, context. Round about the kind of turn of the century, a new set of crime recording standards were being introduced in England and Wales, which was impacting on the way that the police were recording crimes. So an unexpected increase in the number of crimes that were being recorded occurred around that time. The same happened in Scotland a few years later when a similar set of recording standards were introduced there. But regardless of where you kind of start, the point, there's a clear drop in crime measured both through the surveys and the police data. On the right, I've only got police recorded crime data, but for Scotland, you can also see a large reduction. It's actually 2 drops, 2 mini drops, one in the kind of 90s into the early 2000s, and then another one from about 2008 onwards. And that's, I'm only using police data there because due to changes in the design of the survey, we don't have as good long-term trend data from the crime survey, but there have been reductions in both those periods observed in the crime survey too, which I'll show you in a second. So we've got clear evidence of a crime drop. But is this an equal crime drop? And in many respects, I mean, I spend a lot of time trying to promote research, promote the crime survey in particular, and at the time when crime was rising, I never had a problem gaining a media audience to talk about any publication that had come out to show changes in crime survey. As soon as crime started to go down, it was a different story. It was very hard to find an audience who was interested in diminishing crime. And I'm not saying it's not a good thing that we've got diminishing crime, but understanding for whom crime was reducing is an important issue, particularly because we want to understand who did not benefit from that dividend. And there's a reasonably small but growing international body of evidence that shows that crime didn't fall equally across social groups or across geographical areas over this period of time. Some of the initial studies, early studies, showed that crime became more concentrated in terms of low-income households, and there was a bit of a focus on that on a number of studies in the US, Sweden and the UK. However, as James and Mackie have pointed out in their work, it's really important to look at multiple dimensions of victims, households and communities. And there are a body of studies that have looked at inequality based on a number of different factors, including age, gender, ethnicity, disability, area characteristics, financial hardship and tenure, and all of them tend to show some aspect of inequality across those studies, but there hasn't really been a study that's pooled all of those together systematically and then looked at the trend in victimisation inequality and how that's changed over time. So that leads us on to the work that I've been doing with some colleagues in Scotland, looking at who benefited the most. So I'm going to present some pieces of work where we use Scottish crime survey data to explore new existing exacerbating inequalities. And really the kind of core of this is exploiting that quasi-longitudinal aspect of the surveys in order to look at social change over time. The first piece looks at change over time in the profile of victims. What's the profile of victims based on their experience of crime over time, based on prevalence, incidence and crime type. And then the second piece looks more specifically at change over time in victimisation inequality across different characteristics of victims, both looking at that in an absolute and a relative way, and I'll explain what that means in a second. So, change in victim profile. This was using data from Scottish crime surveys from 1992 up to 2014-15. So we had about 100,000 people involved in the survey. So it's a really, again, using quasi-longitudinal analysis, you get really great, huge samples. We were looking principally at prevalence and incidence of victimisation events, and we took 38 separate offence types from the survey, and we kind of smooshed that down into 4 particular crime groups: motor vehicle crime, household crime, personal theft and robbery, and assaults and threats. And we used latent class analysis to group classes of victims based on type and number of incidents of victimisation that they'd experienced. So this is a spot the difference test. They are different charts, but they do look identical. This is the descriptive analysis looking at on the left, it's the prevalence of victimisation for these 4 different crime groups. So you can see that the largest group was motor vehicle crime, and that came down the most. Other types of household crime, including, well, you call it burglary, we call it housebreaking, but theft from homes, that also declined. We had a modest decline in personal theft and robbery, but we didn't see any actual decline in assaults and threats over that period of time. That's the kind of light solid line. On the right, I'm looking at incidents. That's the average number of incidents of victimisation experienced amongst individuals, and you can see the pattern is more or less identical for incidence and prevalence. Using latent class analysis, we identified 4 types of victim based on their incidence of crime victimisation and the type of crime victimisation. So on the right-hand side of this graph, you can see there's something that says group. We find 4 groups of one, the largest group, about 82% of all the people in the sample were non-victims or had a probability of being a non-victim, or very, very low probability of being a victim over that period of time. Around 12% fell into a class of one-off property crime victims, either motor vehicle or other household crime. Another group were called multiple mixed victims, so they had on average 2 or 2.5 incidents of crime per year of a mixture of household or personal crime. And then the smallest group, only around 1% of people fell into this frequent personal victimisation class, and they mostly experienced personal assaults, robberies, or personal theft and threats. I'm not going to explain that in more detail, but this is a complicated diagram that basically shows the combination of crime type and incidence. So we've got these 4 different crime classes, and when we looked at change over time in these classes, this is what we found, is that, as you would expect with the crime drop, is that the probability of being in this kind of non-victim class increased over time because we had more non-victims. The probability of being a one-off property crime victim declined markedly over time. There was a small decline in the probability of being a multiple mixed victim, and no change at all in being a frequent personal victim. So essentially what we're seeing is that those who benefited most in terms of victimisation incidence and type were one-off property crime victims, whereas those who experienced the most incidents of victimisation, particularly personal crimes, assaults, thefts and threats, that group did not change at all. And when we looked at the incidence of crime within those groups, you can see the groups on the left-hand side. My husband hates it when I navigate because I can never get my left and my right. On the left-hand side, you can see the 3 victim groups. You can see that one-off property victims and multiple mixed victims saw reductions in incidence of almost everything except personal theft and robbery, which actually didn't change very much, whereas those frequent personal victims saw no change in anything except assaults and threats, and that went up in that group. So this is evidence of an emerging inequality in terms of who was becoming a victim, or the types of victims that we had. But it didn't tell us anything about who these people were, or who might be more likely to experience victimisation. So this brings us on to the second piece of work, looking more specifically at victimisation inequality. For this, we're looking at data from 2008-9 onwards in Scotland. There is an update to this piece of work. We've actually just added in another sweep, so when we publish this, it will be a slightly different presentation of the data. However, the results actually are pretty similar. We couldn't go back beyond 2008-9 to look at victim characteristics because changes in the design of the study meant that we didn't have comparative data. We're looking at the number of incidents of crime, and that's converted into a victimisation rate. And we're looking at these 8 specific types of characteristics of victims, as you can see there, to try and understand more about how victimisation has changed for individuals in different groups within those categories. Just as a backdrop, this is the drop overall in victimisation in Scotland since 2008-9. You can see it's halved. That's the prevalence level has halved. Scotland, so if you're thinking of relocating, now is a pretty good time, although house prices are mad. We used a statistical model, so we started with 8 individual separate models, one for each of our 8 characteristics, looking at each predictor and then using an interaction with survey years so we could see whether there was a significant change over time. And then we looked at a full adjusted model where we added all of our variables in and continued to test for an interaction with survey year for each of our variables. So in this way, we're comparing unadjusted and adjusted models. And that's a really important thing to do because on one hand, you want to look at, what is the absolute level of change for a particular group. And that tells you one thing about the victim population and it allows you to apply certain types of crime prevention technologies. But on the other hand, you also want to look at the adjusted changes. So if someone with a certain characteristic, if you see that there's an increase in victimisation, is that caused by other characteristics rather than the one thing that you're looking at? It will become apparent once I start showing you the results. And there's some technical detail there. We used weighted least squares and quasi-Poisson models, and we used a simulation method to test for statistical significance in terms of our measure of victimisation inequality, which I'm going to present graphically rather than in numbers. So hopefully you can see that all right. It's a bit small on my screen. So this is the preliminary analysis using the unadjusted model. So each of these are all separate models. And on the top row, that's the change in the victimisation rate. And what you can see there is that victimisation dropped for just about everybody. So win-win, almost every group, regardless of what it was, fell with the exception of one. And that was people from minority ethnic groups. Now that is a very small group in Scotland in population terms. So when you look at a sample with minority ethnic groups, it's small. So there's very wide confidence intervals around it. But it's clear from that graph that there's very little, if any, change in the victimisation rate from people from minority ethnic backgrounds. On the bottom row, that is our change in victimisation inequality measure, and all of them are highlighted in red because all of them had a statistically significant interaction with time. In other words, there was a significant change over time in whatever the threshold of inequality was at the beginning of that period to the end. I'm going to pick out, does this thing work? I think it does. These 3 here, that is financial. It's a measure of financial hardship. Could you find £100 in an emergency if you really needed to? So we've kind of labelled that financial hardship. The next one's Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, and the next one's social tenure. These are 3 measures of kind of financial or socioeconomic deprivation, if you like. All of those show that there was an inequality at the beginning of the period, and that increased towards the end, particularly for financial hardship. We also see a couple of things where inequality has reduced, and that is age and sex. So you can see that the gap between the age groups has reduced, particularly between the very youngest group and the next nearest groups, but actually they're statistically significant for all of those groups. And there's also been a reduction in gender inequality now, with a qualification. So men were more likely to be victimised in Scotland at the beginning of the period, and now their likelihood of victimisation is the same as women. Whether we call that equality or not is something that could be debated. I will leave that for question time. The 2 things that interest me the most are these 2, which both show no evidence of inequality at the beginning of the period, but an increase in inequality towards the end, and that is disability and ethnic group. So what we've seen is an emerging inequality as crime has fallen between those with disability and non-disability, and those from ethnic groups and those from the white majority groups. That is of concern to me. The second bit of analysis, the adjusted model. So here we put everything in together. So in effect, what we're trying to do here is parse out the specific effect or association between each characteristic, regardless of all the other factors. So we're controlling for all of those. So in a way, it's giving us relative inequality based on that one thing, taking account of everything else. On the top line, it's pretty much the same, reduced victimisation rate across the board. Only 4 of these interactions with time were statistically significant this time. But again, I think it's interesting that this shows a continued increasing inequality in terms of financial hardship amongst those who were victims and those who weren't. A reduction in age inequality, but and a continued widening of inequality between those from black or minority ethnic backgrounds and those from the white majority. But the most interesting one for me actually is the second one there, disability. So it continues to show a widening in terms of inequality between those who were disabled and those who weren't. But if you compare that line on the bottom graph, this one here, oh, sorry, not that one there, this one here, to the previous graph, when you adjust for other characteristics, oh, goodness me, it shouldn't be allowed out. When you adjust for other characteristics, the emergence, the inequality for people with disabilities was there at the beginning. You just couldn't see it if you only look in a descriptive way at the data. And that's because people with disabilities tend to be hidden behind other characteristics, age, sex, other things that mask the degree of inequality that are experienced by those from disabled backgrounds. So that's why it's so important to look at both adjusted and unadjusted measures in these longitudinal comparisons. I want to add a note of caution here because there's been a lot of change in survey design and response rate and other things over the course of that period of time that we were looking at. So this is some data taken from the technical report from the most recent Scottish Crime and Justice Survey. You can see there that the response rate to the survey is reduced by 24% over that period. That's not unique to the Scottish Crime Survey. It's happened across many surveys in Scotland and elsewhere. Across the UK, it's a phenomenon. People are less likely to want to respond. The problem is there bias in that shift in response rate? Are we, what type of people are we measuring when we have a reduced response? We've also seen a reduction in the core achieved sample in the Scottish surveys from about 16,000 in 2008-9 down to just over 5,500 now. That's a 65% reduction in the number of people that we ask these questions of. And over that period of time, we've seen the prevalence of victimisation half, as I mentioned earlier. So a combination of reduced response rate, reduced sample, and reduced prevalence of victimisation ultimately means far fewer people that we are studying in terms of their experience of victimisation. And the raison d'etre of the crime survey is to look at victims of crime, to measure crime. And we are no longer doing that as efficiently as we could be. Added to that, and these are not figures that are in the report, but we've calculated these figures. If you take all of that and look at the total number of victims who are interviewed between those two periods, that's gone down by 81%, and the number of repeat victims has gone down by 85%. So arguably, are we still doing a good job at measuring victimisation using a crime survey that has suffered from these 3 connected problems? So just to summarise the findings, I think group-based quasi-longitudinal analysis of crime survey data has shown a reduction in one-off property crime victims. So the people that were least likely to be victims really in the first place have been the biggest winners in terms of the crime drop, but no reduction really in those who are repeat victims, particularly those that experience personal crime. That kind of modelling over time shows that declines in victimisation rates for most social demographic groups. So that's the good news story. And really, in some ways, policymakers can hide behind good news stories like that when there are large reductions in crime across all groups. But there are inequality between groups, and we need to do more to bring that out of these surveys. There's evidence of existing new and exacerbating inequalities in victimisation, which depend on whether you look at absolute or relative measures. I think disability, ethnicity and financial hardship are areas of most concern from the analysis that we have done. I would like to see whether that is observed in other surveys in other countries. So at an aggregate level, the inequality between victims and non-victims has increased, but the picture is very complex when you look at an individual level, so there's much more that could be done with the crime survey and all that rich data it collects to look at that. Just some final conclusions, implications from me. The introduction of that repeat cross-sectional crime survey in the 80s, it captured a really unprecedented moment of social transformation. We were really lucky to have that data and to continue to have ongoing cross-sectional sweeps of data like the crime survey. It's a real gift, particularly at times of financial strain on the public purse, so please use it. The quasi-longitudinal potential of the crime surveys has yet to be fully realised. I think we could do much more around looking at the kind of longitudinal nature of those data, particularly looking at change in both kind of patterns of crime and victims. I pick out Steve Farrell and his team's work on the Thatcherism and Crime Project as a really great example of how they've taken the British Crime Survey and transformed it and used it for something really innovative to look at, change in crime alongside other social changes. I'd love to see more projects like that. The unadjusted and adjusted models, I think, are worth investigating in more detail. Research is a bit patchy on whether it uses one or the other, but quite often not both. And that can inform the development of crime reduction policies in different ways, particularly those who are at greatest risk of offending, or not offending, that's my other hat, victimisation. But I'll leave you with the note of caution around this, changes in sample design. We can control sample size. We can't control response rate to such a great extent, but we could do more around that. Victimisation prevalence, obviously that is in the lap of the gods. But all of that increases uncertainty about estimates. And if we want to really properly understand the changing nature of crime, we need to try and make sure that we design out as many of those things that might create uncertainty as possible, especially when we're looking at very low volume, but very high impact crimes. Thank you very much.